Welcome, everybody. Tonight, I have before me a simple task: introducing a speaker whose work I've admired for many years and who needs no introduction. But is it really a simple task? To do this speaker justice, I need to communicate my admiration without being trite or cliché. Introductions as a genre are simple. I'll be effective if I just tell you the name of our speaker and their topic. But introducing someone who is truly outstanding is hard because it is difficult to alert you, my listeners, to the singular greatness of today's speaker. I've introduced many speakers, and you as an audience have heard many introductions. The other day, I was, doing what you do, reading a 2-week-old New Yorker article by David Remnick, in which he talks about Bob Dylan. In discussing the mixed reception that met Dylan's receiving of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2016, Remnick cites someone who could relate to Dylan, Leonard Cohen. Leonard Cohen's reaction to Dylan's having received the Nobel Prize in Literature is a remarkable literary nugget all its own. Awarding the prize to Dylan, Cohen said, is like pinning a medal on Mount Everest for being the highest mountain. Only a fellow lyricist and poet could properly respond to whatever animus was coming Dylan's way from the world of writers. There are times, Cohen is saying, when even the greatest of accolades are beneath the person who receives them. Robert Alter is the Bob Dylan of Jewish literary scholarship. They even have the same first name. His fame precedes him so much that anything I say by way of introduction is insufficient. If accurate, it will seem obvious or unnecessary. Like Dylan, Alter has received prizes, fellowships, book prizes, lifetime achievement awards, and 6 honorary doctorates, including one from Northwestern University here in 2016. In the broader world, Alter is best known for his individual translation of the complete Hebrew Bible that appeared in 2018 and was the subject of a New York Times Magazine feature that we were just discussing. The translation is special for a variety of reasons, but one of the most important is that it was produced by a scholar who, more than any other individual, provoked a return and re-examination of the Hebrew Bible as a work of literature worthy of literary analysis. In The Art of Biblical Narrative and The Art of Biblical Poetry, Professor Alter argued through demonstration that the Bible was an aesthetically compelling work. The new translation sits on the foundation of that older work, highlighting the value of bringing a discerning literary eye to every verse of Tanakh. If people know that Professor Alter reinvented biblical studies in the 1980s, they often don't know that he wrote several books about the novel before he turned his attention to the Bible. He's written books about Nabokov and Stendhal, Fielding, and Kafka. He's one of the leading scholars in the international study of Hebrew literature. Tonight's keynote is part of a conference being convened in honor of the 100th anniversary of the publication of the first edition of Shai Agnon's book, Al Kapot HaMan'ul, At the Handles of the Lock. The conference is being produced by 4 entities: the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies here at Northwestern, Proof Texts, a journal of Jewish literary history, Hebrew Union College, which is the rabbinical school of Reform Judaism and Proof Text's institutional home, and Agnon House, a museum and organization dedicated to the legacy of another Nobel laureate in literature, the Hebrew writer Shai Agnon. Tonight, Robert Alter will speak to us on the topic Shai Agnon and Gustave Flaubert, Hebraizing a French Master. The lecture will focus on a novella of Agnon's entitled Sipur Pashut, or A Simple Story. Like my simple task, the title, A Simple Story, is misleading. Stories can be simple. Boy meets girl, they fall in love, something interferes, they overcome barriers and live happily ever after. Agnon's simple story starts out resembling such a story. A boy, Herschel, meets a girl, Bluma. They fall in love. Something, in the form of Herschel's mother, interferes by marrying Herschel to a more appropriate girl, Minna, and Herschel becomes increasingly lovesick to the point of institutionalization. The reader travels through the novel expecting the simple resolution to the simple story. Surely Herschel and Bluma will wind up together. Agnon plays with this reader's expectation until the very end of the story. The story resolves with Herschel's learning to love his wife Minna and be present in that relationship. Bluma doesn't get resolution at all. Professor Alter tonight will be reading Agnon in conversation with the French novelist Gustave Flaubert, known most for his novels Madame Bovary and Sentimental Education. Through an analysis of specific passages in a simple story, Professor Alter will highlight the way that Agnon, unlike Flaubert, is attentive to the character's unconscious. It gives me great joy to introduce Professor Robert Alter.
Thank you very much for your kind remarks. Two things I'm going to say about my presentation. I'm going to be illustrating what I say with a few short passages. They are short, and I am not using PowerPoint. I grew up in an era when the principal means of communication was smoke signals. So I don't do well with PowerPoint. 3 weeks ago, I gave a lecture in Jerusalem, and I made a hash out of the PowerPoint, and the kindly professor who introduced me had to rescue me. So I won't try that, but I think you'll be able to follow because the passages are short. The second thing is, as is my wont, I will be speaking from notes, because I personally have a certain allergic to texts prepared and written. I think it's much harder for the lecturer to make contact with the audience. Okay, let me begin by noting something that all of you Agnon specialists at the conference are well aware of, that Agnon was coy and evasive about his connection to European literature. Sometimes he pretended, this was one aspect of his enterprise, that he was nothing but a Hebrew teller of tales in the pious idiom that had been in use since the era of the early rabbis. I think the perfect illustration of his coyness on this front was shortly after he got the Nobel Prize. He was interviewed at the Shokin Library in Jerusalem. And at one point, the interviewer said, a lot of people have attributed an influence of Kafka to you. How do you feel about that? And you could hear him getting annoyed. And he said something like this, Kafka, I've barely read one book by his. Of course, he barely wrote 3 books. And he said, of course, my wife has the complete writings of Kafka on her shelves. So that's typical of the way he played the game. Now, connections between the 1935 novel, A Simple Story, and Flaubert have often been made, and there's certain... Oh, I should add the following. Although though Agnon played his cards close to the chest on foreign influences, there are 2 mentions he made of Flaubert. One is in his novel set in World War I Germany, Adhena. He mentions in passing a character whose face looks like the face of Flaubert. And I thank Jeff Sachs for pointing out this reference. But more helpfully, and I'd like to read a couple of lines and parse it, in a letter to Zalman Shokin, who was his lifelong patron, he says the following. The letter was written December 17th, 1916, so in the middle of the First World War when he was living in Germany. Flaubert and everything about him touches me deeply, nogea ad libi. This is a poet who mortified himself in the tent of poetry. And the Hebrew there is memit atzmo be'ohala shel shira, which is based on a rabbinic idiom, to mortify yourself in the tent of Torah. So notice the significant substitution / equivalence between Torah and Shira art. It is fitting for every writer to read about him before he writes and after he writes. Then no book would be blighted. Okay, in the 1916 letter to Shokin, what he emphasizes is not the particulars of Agnon's craft, but rather his model as a writer totally ascetically devoted to writing. And this, I think, was one model for him as he moved from Palestine to a stay in Germany that ended up covering a decade. That is, in his early writing, he was, very young, in his early 20s. There's a tendency to a kind of lyric effusiveness. When he got to Germany over the late teens and early 20s, he radically revised a number of the stories that he had written in Palestine a decade earlier. And what he did was to clean them up and to tone them down. For example, his first published story, Agunot, has a paragraph which goes on and on for almost a page about the desolation of the main character, Ben Uri. In the revision, that long paragraph becomes Ben Uri shachav kinor shenutku metarav. Ben Uri lay prostrate like a violin whose strings have been broken. So you see that Flaubertian process of honing down. Now, Flaubert began in a first draft of Madame Bovary with 3,000 pages, and it came out as a 250-page masterpiece. But actually what I'm going to talk about is a little bit different. We've heard some illuminating lectures this afternoon about themes in Agnon's representation of erotic experience and so forth. I'd like to talk about the technical side, but I'll try not to make it boring for those who are not students of literature. So the first, but by the way, I should say this, that the notion that Sipur Pashut, a simple story, was influenced by Flaubert is not news. I mean, it's been observed by many critics. And usually what is observed is the fact that it resembles Flaubert in general and not necessarily the specific plot of Madame Bovary and the European realist novel of the 19th century in the kind of subject it is. As you heard in the brief summary, it's about unhappy love that's frustrated. It's about the oppressive restrictions and demands of materialistic bourgeois society. Hirschel's parents are definitely part of the Jewish bourgeois, and they choose a wife for their son who will reflect their materialist values. So all that is similar, and there's not much more to be said about it, I don't think. I'd like to look at the book from the level of technique. Now, what's usually said is that Agnon picked up from Flaubert the technique of what literary scholars these days call free indirect style, from the French style indirect libre. I'll explain that very briefly for the non-literary people among you. Basically, it's representing the character's thought in language that the character would have spoken to himself or to herself, but mediated by the narrator, so that it's in third person and the verbs are past tense rather than present tense. The Harvard scholar Dorit Cohn, in a wonderful book years ago, coined a different word, a different term. She called it narrated monologue. In other words, it's monologue, but it's monologue reported, mediated by a narrator. Alas, that term never caught on, so we're stuck with free indirect discourse, free indirect style. So there's some of that in Sipur Pashut, but actually, when you look at Madame Bovary, there's not as much of that as you would think. I should say this, that one, I think, brilliant novella by Agnon, which he regionally composed during his first stay in Palestine, Hill of Sand, Givat HaChol, that is full of narrated monologue, free and direct discourse. And the difference from Flaubert there is that it's very psychoanalytic. That is, the technique is used to show how the main character, Chemdat, talking to himself, half admits something that he won't admit, which is things that he's unconscious of, like the appealing young woman whom he's really desirous of, to whom he's giving Hebrew lesson. So there's less of that than you would think in Madame Bovary, and also it's only scattered in a simple story. But I'll give you one or two examples. From Madame Bovary, after Emma has her first adulterous sexual experience with a neighboring aristocrat named Rodolphe, this is what is reported of her. Seeing herself in the mirror, she was amazed by her face. Never had she had eyes so big, so black, nor such depth. Something subtle spread through her person and transfigured it. Now, all this is Emma talking to herself. And she's really deluded in what she's saying to herself. That she imagines that she's been elevated to a new level of existence where she's only deluding herself and having sex with a very cynical, loveless aristocrat. Okay, one more. This is after Rodolphe has jilted her. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I want to go on to a simple story. This is the free and direct discourse associated with Cyril, Herschel's mother, who is very domineering, very materialistic, and penny pinching. She has, as you say in Yiddish, alamilas. Okay, so seemingly a denial. She's decided she's not going to pay her poor cousin Bluma for doing the housework. She's just going to give her room and board. So this is what she thinks. Seemingly, a denial of payment was involved in this. But whoever looks into the heart of the matter sees that Cyril was right. For when Bluma comes to marry, will Cyril run around to charities and say, provide a dowry for my relative? No. She herself will give according to the number of years she has served. Besides, what payment could Bluma expect? Why, she had never been a servant for others, and so she has been learning about housework from Cyril. Now, everything in this little bit is Cyril lying to herself. That is, first, she says, whoever looks into the matter deeply, right? Meaning whoever thinks like me. And then she imagines that at some distant point, when Bloom is ready to get married, she will give her, and here is a small instance of Hebraizing the technique. She will pay her kamishpat avadim. Kamishpat hashanim asher avda, which is a phrase used to describe what happens to a Hebrew slave, an Eved Ivri, at the end of his 7 years of indenture. So, in other words, she wouldn't think this. Here the narrator is mediating, because she's thinking in Yiddish, and she probably doesn't know her Torah in Hebrew particularly well. But the narrator, by introducing this slyly, and Agnon is one of the slyest of writers, is suggesting she's basically treating her relative as a slave. Let's see. And then when she adds, what payment would she ask for after she learned everything from Cyril? Cyril knows nothing about housework. She hardly ever touches a pot or a pan. And when Bloom arrives at the house, it turns out that she's been cooking and baking and cleaning for her own household, where her mother is failing in health, and then her father dies as well. Okay, so here you have an illustration of the same technique, somewhat Hebraized, as it goes from Flaubert to Agnon. And I want to emphasize, this is not simple imitation. You have a brilliant writer reading another brilliant writer who pays careful attention to the way the earlier writer operates and says, hey, that's a good idea. I could work with that. So it's not a matter of simple emulation. Okay. One last example of this technique from a simple story. Herschel marries, not the bride of his choice, and a son is born. And the son is very ill. They're really concerned for his survival. At this point, Herschel thinks, if Bluma were caring for him, that is the baby, he would regain his health. And so Herschel would imagine himself standing on one side of his son and Bluma on the other, and his son recovering. Now that sentence is not free and direct discourse. It's the narrator reporting what is going on in Herschel's head. But then one more sentence of free indirect discourse. God in heaven knows that Herschel's sole intention was for the sake of his son, which of course is self-evidently wrong. That's what he's saying to himself. So I have no interest in Bloom, I'm just concerned that the kid survived. But of course we know what he's thinking about constantly, compulsively, is Bluma. Now, I'd like to go on to illustrate how consciousness is described. I'm sorry, just ignore that. It's too much trouble to turn off. Okay. I was going to turn off the phone and I forgot to. My apologies. There are other ways of representing consciousness. So let's look at this. It's Emma after Rodolphe has cast her away. Of course, she's had all kinds of fantasies about her great love for him and vice versa, and now she's shattered. And this is what Flaubert writes, only a couple of sentences. It seemed to her suddenly that fire-colored globules were bursting in the air like incandescent balls, flattening out and turning to melt into the snow among the branches of the trees. In the center of each of them, Rodolphe's face appeared. Now, I'd like to underscore how much this is a breakthrough in the technique of the novel. I can't recall many instances, maybe off the top of my head, none, before Flaubert, where hallucinatory or discombobulated states of consciousness are represented in the fiction. That's sort of below the radar of the novelist. But here she's totally bewildered and shattered, and she sees in a hallucinatory state these globules, these multicolored globules floating through the air and flattening out, and in each one, Rodolphe's face. So it's a beautiful way of representing, I would say visually, rather than verbally, the tenor of Emma's consciousness at this point of crisis. Now, I think that when Agnon read Madame Bovary, which of course in 1916 he would have had to read in German. He did not know French. I have a suspicion the first Hebrew translation by Dvorah Baron, who was discussed this afternoon, with Agnon, the first Hebrew translation came out in 1931. And I find it hard to imagine that Agnon wouldn't at least have leafed through Dvorah Baron's Hebrew Madame Bovary, if not reading it from cover to cover. So in the early 1930s, as he was thinking about writing a simple story, Madame Bovary would have been fresh by his reading it in a second version. So here, and I think when he read a passage like this, which certainly would have caught his eye as a novelist, with those globules floating through the air and popping, he thought, that's a great way to do things. I could do something like that too. So here is a brief moment from the Hanukkah party in a simple story, a party at which Herschel, who is engaged but not yet married, feels extremely uncomfortable. They're playing cards, because you probably know in pious communities, they thought it wasn't kosher to play cards all year long, but you could do it on Hanukkah or on the night of Nittel, of Christmas. And the cards leaped from the hands of the card players with a strange rapidity until the hands could not be seen among them. Finally, the cards too disappeared, and black and red faces could be seen in the room, dancing before him and mocking. I'm sorry. Is there somewhere I can bury this? Okay, ignore it. You're listening to me, not my cell phone. So you can see what's happening. He's not comfortable. He feels that he's in an alien milieu. And as the cards get shuffled and passed around the table, they turn into something hallucinatory. First, the red and white faces, of course, are the red and white faces from the cards, and the concrete reality dissolves in the hallucination. It works in a way very similar to the passage with Rodolphe's faces that I just read. And you can see how a great writer can give another great writer ideas, which he then implements brilliantly. Okay, one last representation of consciousness in this fashion from the Agnon novel. After his marriage, he's desperately unhappy, and this unhappiness leads him to a psychotic break at a certain point. And what he does is, every night, he goes to the house where Bluma is now living, and he just lingers outside, looking up at her window. A veil had fallen over all the world, and you can't even see yourself. But the image of Bluma broke through and rose before you as on the day she caressed your head when you came into her room, and she fled and came back. Herschel rested his head on the handles of the lock and began to weep. It's, I think, a very touching moment. And here again, you see a small maneuver of Hebraizing. That is, the narrator is now speaking, not Herschel, when he says Herschel rested his head, because that's a report of a character's action. And where does he rest his head? Al Kapot Hamanul, which is the title of the volume of stories we're discussing in these 2 days. And Al Kapot Hamanul, on the handles of the lock, is a phrase that comes from the Song of Songs. And it's beautifully strategic because what occurred, the passage in which it occurs, that the beloved rushes to the door after sort of teasing her lover and puts her hand on the handles of the lock. Yadai natfu mor, my hand dripped myrrh over the handles of the lock, and he's gone. So the lovers are separated. And she's stricken with terror and runs out into the darkened streets of the night city trying to find him. So you can see how a writer picks up a technique from another writer, develops it in his own way, and taps into the distinctive resources of his own language. Okay, now I guess I'll deal with one more procedure, which is the narrators in both books often make incisive judgments that pull together our perception as readers of what's really going on. So you see, there's a whole arsenal of techniques, from representing the unspoken language of the character to giving you a visual representation of the hallucinatory experience of the character. I'm going to put this back there, maybe we won't hear it so much. Okay. And both novelists move back and forth from one technique to another. So if at some points the narrator seems to be merging with the character, at other points he's sticking a pin into the character. And I'll give you just two examples which should suffice. Two from each. Flaubert. Charles, Dr. Bovary, early in their marriage, is very happy to be married to Emma. And there are clear indications that he's sexually happy with her. There are no indications that she's sexually happy with him, or if she is, it quickly wears off. And this is what we're told. He went out of his house, chewing over his happiness like those who still masticate after dinner the taste of truffles they are digesting. So, and by the way, both Agnon and Flaubert make brilliant tactical use of metaphors and similes. So this relishing the taste of the truffles suggests something very materially based and one might say a little bit animalistic about his experience of happiness with Emma. I once ate in France in a 4-star Michelin restaurant in the provinces with my wife, and there was a not very well-dressed family sitting at the next table. And at one point, he got up, the husband, and took pictures of them and what they were eating. That he had to eternalize this experience. It's a little bit like what Dr. Bovary is represented as here. A second one, Rodolphe, who dismisses quite cynically his mistress's protestation of love. It said, it's the narrator now making a generalization, which occasionally you find in Agnon too. Human speech, thinking of the protestations of love which he dismisses, human speech is like a cracked cauldron on which we bang melodies to make bears dance when one would want to reach the stars. It's actually a famous sentence, and you can see how devastating it is. Okay, Agnon, two illustrations of this technique. Herschel is standing outside the home where Bloema is staying. As soon as he reached that place, he hid so that no one would see him, like a drunk who pours himself a drink and is afraid they will come and take it from his hand. So this is, I think, is devastating in its own way as the Flaubert passage, because as a drunk and clinging to his glass of liquor, it suggests that his love for Bloema is a kind of crippling addiction, like the alcoholic's addiction to drink. Finally, my last illustration, again from Agnon, and this too is from those chapters in which Herschel is described standing outside Bloema's home, in some instances in the rain. Like a man standing on the night of Tisha B'Av, when the heavens open, and raises his eyes above to plead for mercy for himself. So Hirschel stood looking up at Blumer's window. What did Hirschel want? Hirschel wanted Blume to open her window and see him, which of course is a desperate desire that is not going to happen. Now, here you can see Agnon taking a technique that he would have observed, maybe not imitate slavishly, but that he observed in Flaubert, and assimilating it to his own realm of cultural references. So there's a folk belief that if on the night of Tisha B'Av you plead to heaven, your plea will be granted. And what works so well here, of course, is in this specifically Jewish reference, is the dissonance between a believing Jew's prayer issued to heaven and a desperate lover's prayer issued one knows not where, to the simple possibility that she will look out the window and see him, which she will not do. Okay, let me summarize very quickly, and then I would be happy to field some questions. Influence seems to me not quite the right term, and I think in recent decades, literary scholars have tended to avoid the term influence. I mean, influence, let's say a great surgeon who has a particular innovative technique for spinal surgery, and his disciple works with him and learns the technique and then uses it. So you can say Dr. X influenced the younger Dr. Y in the procedures used for spinal surgery. Whereas there's something, I would say, more like alchemy in the transfer from one writer to another. That is, if this later writer is an original writer in his own right, as Agnon certainly was, and very alive to the resources of his medium, then what happens is that the later writer learns from the earlier one, or sees in the earlier one. I don't want to say learns. Sees in the earlier writer possibilities of how you handle narration in the novel, and begins to say, well, I can do something like that. I'm going to do it a little differently, but it's going to be a resource for me as a writer. And I think that that is what happened with Agnon and Flaubert. That is, Agnon saw in Flaubert not only an ascetic devoted to painstaking art who would mortify himself in the tent of poetry, but he also saw specific procedures. And as I've argued this evening, free and direct discourse was only one of those procedures. And from them, he learned how to shape and perfect his own art. My sense is that a simple story is probably Agnon's most perfect novel. Not necessarily his greatest. You know, it doesn't have the scope of Tmol Shulshom, Only Yesterday, or the maybe deeply resonant themes of his last uncompleted novel, Shira. But almost every detail is perfectly honed and worked out with technical precision that makes it, I think, after all these years, still one of the most satisfying novels read in Hebrew. Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah. Let's hope it doesn't act up. Okay. I'd be happy to try to respond to a few questions.
Do you want to come over there?
Okay.
Okay, it looks like Marina has a question.
I'll come to I came to the front. Professor Alter, you argued that the depiction of hallucinatory experiences of consciousness is a novel phenomenon in Flaubert and in Agnon as the Hebrew in Hebrew literature, and I agree. But I'm troubled because I recall representations of hallucinations in satire, in the genre of satire, from Don Quixote to Hebrew satire, Mendele Moicher Sforim. He constantly has characters hallucinating, and I think it's quite different. But how would you formally explain the difference between a modernist kind of consciousness hallucination, like those droplets, and in satire?
Well, which satires do you think of in Hebrew?
In Hebrew, Mendele Moicher Sforim. Let's take Travels of Benjamin. He's the third. He comes to a place and he's a little bit crazy, but he is imagining like Don Quixote, like he's imagining all kinds of things, and in the Nag is hallucinations happening. But it's not the same, so I wonder.
Yeah, I think it's not the same because in Mendele, he's representing, as you say, satirically, a deluded character. So it's somebody who has wild and preposterous ideas, and those ideas are represented by Mendele. Whereas in the example I gave from both Agnon and Flaubert, you have two characters who are not ordinarily delusional, and something about that moment in the narration for them. In the case of Emma, it's being thrust out the door by Rodolphe, and in the case of Herschel, it's being among these people at the Hanukkah party who really are outside his milieu, and it's part of his being pushed into a marriage he doesn't want. So it is a hallucinatory experience triggered by the conjunction of circumstances at that moment in the narration.
Thank you very much.
Are there other questions?
Do you have it turned on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we know if Agnon read Fontane?
If he did what?
If he read the German novelist Fontane?
He probably did. He read very extensensively
because
in German literature.
Because, as you know, free and direct discourse exists in other languages. Also, erlebte Rede is the German term, and Fontane uses it. So why do we have to assume that he discovered, and by the way, it exists in English also. George Eliot Middlemarch is full of free and direct discourse. So why should we assume that his use of the equivalent in Hebrew came from Flaubert, since he did not read French, if I understand you. And there is actually one novella of Fontana, Irungen Wirungen, which is very similar in content to Simple Story.
Well, I can't vouchsafe which works he would have read and which he didn't.
Right.
So, well, I know for sure that he read Madame Bovary. Okay, I would say this, that there's hardly any procedure in literature that doesn't have antecedents. For example, it's often thought that Flaubert invented or maybe perfected the technique of free and direct discourse. In fact, you can find it in the 17th century in La Princesse de Clèves. So there are always some early precursors to what then becomes a full-fledged procedure. Yeah.
Jeff, and then Wendy.
On behalf of the library of the Agnon House, I can confirm that he has the complete works of Fontana, the 1905 edition, and he also, in addition to having read Madame Bovary, presumably, of course you're correct, in German, he had the first edition of Dvora Baron's translation dedicated to him, which we still have, by Baron, which we still have in the library, which he presumably also read.
Yes, I want to alert everybody else that Jeffrey Sachs is a treasure house of information, bibliographic and otherwise, on Agnon.
Yes, and to follow that, I mean, we also know that there, in addition to the borrowing of these techniques that you so beautifully laid out to us, there are explicit allusions, borrowings from elements of Madame Bovary, the blind beggar image, I mean, which you wrote about it years ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, we know that in this case, he was responding to that novel. So I guess what I would love for you to add as a coda for us is how, knowing that he used this technique, how it helps us interpret the, I guess, the plot or the denouement of the novel, knowing as we know that Madame Bovary is an utter explosion of the happily ever after motif. And it seems in this case that Agnon is choosing to make his character live happily ever after, but in a way we don't want his character to live.
Yeah, I think, and here I'm in strong agreement with what Nietzsche wrote about this. Of course, Nietzsche and I have a dangerous proclivity to be in strong agreement about most everything. I think that it's a pseudo-happy ending. And for me, well, let me tie that in what you ask about how observing the technique helps with interpretation. If you see how self-deluded Hirschel is about his feelings for Bluma, as in that one passage in particular about the sick infant, you're aware of the fact that he has a capacity for self-deception that will carry him through right till the end, carry him to a point where he believes that he's come, as we say in Hebrew, el hamenucha vel hanachala, to a happy resting place, and is good now being a proper member of bourgeois society, somebody who works in his parents' store, and is happy with the wife they have chosen for him. And I think that seeing how he can deceive himself, one suspects that he can deceive himself in this respect also. And for me, one of the clues to the end of the novel is the blind beggar. Now, the blind beggar, is, of course, is important in Madame Bovary. Emma hears him every time she goes off for an assignation with her second lover. And as she's dying, the last thing she hears is the blind beggar singing. Okay, we have the whole package in Agnon. And again, as Nietzsche has pointed out, there's also the blind beggar singing in Rabbi Nachman, which would have been important for Agnon. And things often have multiple sources in literature. So the blind beggar is associated with the world of song, the world that Cyril does not belong to. She was not capable even of singing lullabies to baby Herschel. And the world of song is associated with the world of, I guess, erotic fulfillment. So the last time he encounters the blind beggar, he throws to him a coin that is much bigger than what the beggar would have expected. So it's as though he's paying off the world of song and eros with Cyril's currency, the currency of hard cash. And that's why I think he may never have another, if you fantasize what's going to happen after the end of the novel, he may never have another psychotic break. He may live an ostensibly well-adjusted life, and he's always going to feel a deep lack somewhere deep within him.
Yeah, thank you so much. May I ask 2 questions?
Yes,
I'm bubbling with
even
more,
three,
but
Maya.
thank you. The first has to do with the term Hebraizing. The way you used it referred more to elusive aspects of the text. But I'm wondering, since you've written a lot about, the development of modern Hebrew prose, if you have thoughts about how reading these, whether it's German or French sort of modern literature, shaped the development of his Hebrew in Sipur Pashut, of the language itself, and of the way he uses Hebrew prose, outside of the elusive, aspects. And
Okay.
then, yeah.
While I have that question completely in mind, I'll answer it, and then you go on.
Or someone else.
I could be wrong. I've not closely inspected Agnon's prose to see if there are German stylistic influences. You could judge that better than I. And my guess would be that here and there may be. But I suspect that there are no consistent or pervasive stylistic influences, just because he was so committed to writing the largely archaizing Hebrew that he wrote. He was certainly thinking, in the first instance, of the idiomatic usage of early rabbinic Hebrew. Some Yiddishisms, of course, creep in. So I don't think that it affected the quality of the prose. Now go on to your next second.
Well, yeah, and I guess I was also thinking about the gender issue here with when free and direct discourse comes in to enter the psyche or the psychotic condition of a woman, versus Agnon bringing it back to the figure of a man or a young man, and trying to understand his troubled psyche. And I was wondering again about like how you thought about this gender question. You know, is there a way in which he uses this technique differently, right? Because he's dealing with this young man, and we talked about it also earlier in this afternoon about how he really enjoys, or he really wants to portray the inner world of young men at this point in his career.
Okay, that's a really good question. Now, of course, we have one highly negative representation of a woman in Sipur Pashut, and that's Cyril, who is the mother from hell. Okay, let's leave her alone. Enough said about that. The truly interesting female character, of course, is Bluma. And Bluma definitely is in love with Herschel when she's working in his house. And that scene, which is alluded to in one of the passages that I read, where she comes into he comes into her room. And she caresses his head and goes out and comes back. That's very erotically charged. And I think that the way we read it is an intimation of a young woman with very natural, healthy desires who is in love with this guy who's actually is a kind of kid. I suppose they both are. They're in their late teens. She's in love with him and feels tenderly toward him. Okay. The flip side of my answer is that we then don't find out much more about Bluma. She pretty much, she entirely disappears from the stage of the novel, and she's only that flitting figure in the window whom Herschel longs for. So I would say that women are not given their due representational course in this novel. And you could argue that this might be true generally of Agnon. He was a man of his time, alas.
Hello.
Oh, Ilana, yeah.
Great to be here and to hear this talk. Gender-wise, I'd like to add Bidmi Mea in the prime of her life. And I think there he does have a very extensive dialogue with Flaubert, precisely from the point of view of gender. I mean, if Madame Bovary is Flaubert, as he himself claimed, I would say that Tirza is Agnon in many ways. So, I think his dialogue with Flaubert has, various facets, and actually in the prime of her life, in Bidmi Mea, you do find this sort of experiment with a woman's perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you for reminding me of that, of course.
And I would add something.
And it's a wonderful novella.
Yeah,
it's not
really
just
amazing.
an arid exercise in representing the other gender.
No, I think in many ways it's his Madame Bovary as well, Bidmi Mea. And I would add to that, given that the Song of Songs is so important, and Al Kapot Man'ul in both cases, that he, as far as Hebraizing is concerned, that he harks back to the Shulamite in the Song of Songs, where you do have very dominant and resonant female voice. So he has both the Song of Songs and Flaubert in his experiment at Bidmi Mea in capturing a woman's perspective on love. And it's another happy ending, which is miserable in its own way, of course.
Right. And I would add, especially since I am extremely proud of all my former students who have done wonderful things with Hebrew literature. Nitsa is one, and Ilana is another. And as Ilana has written, say, Agnon's novella Shvat Amunim, which is called Betrothed in English, it's a really innovative modernist fiction, and it's unintelligible unless you know the Song of Songs inside out. So that's a perfect illustration of Hebraizing a mode of fiction that may start elsewhere. I think somebody here.
I mean, there's another character. Minna is a character.
Really?
Minna as a character in the novella is more complex.
Yeah, I suppose so.
First of all, thank you very much for the lecture, but I wanted to ask you.
It might have gotten turned off.
Okay, thank you very much for the lecture, but I wonder, you focused on Sipur Pashut, and why only on that? I assume that the borrowing of the technique happened to Agnon also in other novellas and stories. So why did you choose to focus on Sipur?
Well, of course. I didn't mean to suggest that certain models, ideas that Agnon picked up from Flaubert were strictly limited to Sipur Pashut. Since well, of course, you can't talk about 10 different works of fiction in 45 minutes, so there was a natural limitation on time in that way. But also, I think what I was going to say. Now I forget what more I was going to say about that. But did you have another part to your question? Okay. Oh yeah, just one little additional thing to my response. That precisely because, as I said in passing, Hebrew criticism has fairly frequently linked Sipur Pashut with Madame Bovary. I thought that it might be instructive to look past or look beneath the certain thematic connections. And this very much reads like I would say, a late 19th century European realist novel. So I thought it would be instructive to look past the thematic connections and to see a range of techniques that also derive from Flaubert.
I expect there might be some people, especially from who are not from the conference, who want to ask questions about the Bible translation project or the Bible work.
Okay. I've talked endlessly about that, but I'm happy to do it.
I run into people all the time who have an issue with one word or this word or that word. I don't like this word. Has it happened that you've encountered that in the world and decided that you're going to change your mind in some subsequent edition?
No, well, here was my procedure. Some of you may know that without at first intending to translate the whole Hebrew Bible, first I did just Genesis and thought that would be that. And then, since it went pretty well, I one more book and then one more book. And eventually, I don't know, perhaps half a dozen books of Bible translation came out, and I was at the 2/3 point. So I said, hey, I can do this. I can get through to the end. And so when I did that, of course, I had to go back to the beginning and read everything through. And my experience was as follows. Say for a particular term, which I had translated one way in Genesis, I saw I had translated it differently in the book of Samuel. And I said, does it work? Does the same word work in both contexts? And if so, which one am I going to choose? And I might change the one in Genesis to accord with the one I had chosen for Samuel. Here and there, when I was rereading my earlier work, I would come across a word, and I said, wait, that's not 100% right. Maybe there's a better way to do it, and I would change a word. Usually not a sentence, but a word. But that was the extent of revision. The completed 3 volumes, the earlier books are basically as they appeared separately. This is something I'll be talking about at the workshop at the University of Chicago on Tuesday, but I was not motivated only by issues of literary style. I also was interested in getting things precise in a way that I think previous translators had not done. And I'll give just one example, I promise, only one, because I'm going to use it Tuesday morning, Ilana. When the tree of knowledge is described, all the translations say something like this: the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree was pleasant to behold and goodly to make one wise, or goodly as a source of wisdom. Now, I'm convinced that that's a mistranslation. Now, I'm saying, lovely to behold, or lovely to the eyes, pleasant to the eyes, these are various translations, is in the Hebrew, ta'ava la'enayim. Now, ta'ava, not only in modern Hebrew, but in many of its occurrences in biblical Hebrew, means something like uncontrollable desire or lust. So I said, hey, I'm going to take a chance, and I translated it as lust for the eyes, ta'ava la'enayim. And there are a few verses like vayitavu ta'ava, where the Israelites have lost all control of their desire. And I think the point of the narrative report in Genesis is to give you a sense that when Eve looks at the tree, it kindles desire in her. She really wants it. Now, the verse ends, everybody translates it this way, as to make wise, lahaskil. And I thought, that doesn't sound right. Is the kind of knowledge that they're going to get wisdom? And then it occurred to me that there is one place in the Bible, in Psalms, where lahaskil, to make wise or to be wise, means to look. And that's ashrei maskil el dal. Happy he who looks to the poor man. And then I discovered, so I think I was the only translation ever to translate this, not as to make wise, but as to look. And then I discovered there was one earlier translation. The Aramaic translation by Onkelos translates it, li'istakala behon. That's like modern Hebrew, li'istakel, to look. So I'm not the only one who had this perception. So There are things in my translation that don't have to do with literary style. They have to do with, damn it, this is what it really means.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Professor Alter.